So the paper I'm going to give today is a version of a paper that I originally gave at a seminar in INGENIO in Valencia last month. And really what it concerns is, I want to argue today that what's important for measuring the value of research is to take an approach that looks at the different scales at which those values are generated, and to trace the way that research flows up the scales into the society and into publics. So what I really want to do today is to talk about attempts in recent years to develop measurements for the public value of research around valorization, commercialization, and technology transfer. I'm going to primarily talk about the field of humanities, but I do that only because it is an interesting area. Some contradictions have been particularly evident in humanities. But the lessons that we can learn from studying humanities about this valorization process, I think, have applicability more generally across science studies, and in particular for understanding how science creates benefits for society. So I want to do today 4 things. I want to argue that there's been a rush to create metrics for the value of research. And in humanities, this has led to a sense of disagreement and dissatisfaction. And so this is the starting point, and what I want to do is understand this dissatisfaction by arguing that the policy concepts that have been used lack a rigorous theoretical structure that have allowed the contradictions to be challenged and resolved and advanced. And so what I'm arguing is that we need to go back to logic, we need to go back to argument, and bring 3 additional kinds of literature into this technology transfer discussion. On the basis of that, I want to articulate a theoretically derived version of where the public value of humanities research might lie, and I explore that in one particular national context, in the Netherlands. And then finally, I use that as an empirical lens to reflect on my conceptual model. And what I argue is that there needs to be a much greater emphasis on what I call interscalar valorization processes. The links in the chain by which a small piece of research produces an action change at a distance in society. And then what I want to do is really raise 4 questions that might form the basis for a future research agenda into valorization in humanities, social sciences, and ultimately for science as a whole. So the first step in the argument is really to claim there's been a misdiagnosis. What we take to be a self-evident problem, the need to measure the impact of humanities research, is actually a result of an incoherence, an underlying incoherence of the policy concepts that underlie the way it's been defined. So here's the first evidence that there is a problem here in measuring humanities value. In 2010, we did a literature review looking at attempts that had been made to define indicators for measuring humanities research and its public value. Whether you define that very narrowly as economic or attempt to take a much broader social view. And we found 31 attempts. And on the basis of that, what we highlighted is firstly that there's a wide-ranging search process underway in the academy. Many different disciplines are involved in this process, many different approaches, many different players in the political economy of research, including academics, policymakers, consultants, and research users. And the clearest finding, the unambiguous one, was that there's no one single good set of measures for the public value of humanities research. And our initial analysis was that this came about because there was a division between the different arguments, and our belief was that if you could somehow bridge across that division, then, looking at the middle ground, you could devise better understandings of public value of humanities research and ultimately better measures of that value. And so we looked at the arguments, and we found that they boiled down to 3 varieties. So there's a big disagreement about whether humanities research value was purely intrinsic, value for its own sake. And measuring that usability lost the intrinsic value. Against a feeling that excellent research, somehow that excellence was related to a definition of use. Excellent research should be useful in some way. Second was a conflict, an argument between a group of people who felt that measuring the value of humanities research impinged on academic freedom. And that was set against those that argued that accountability for public resources for research demanded a measurement and proof of that use. And then thirdly, there was a group who argued that because humanities research was so different to science, where outcomes were easily measured, that attempts shouldn't be made. And there was another group who argued that, well, this precisely is why they had to measure it. They had to show that arts and humanities research was just as useful as STEM subjects for society. But really, when we looked a bit closer into the dynamics of these arguments, looking for this middle ground, we discovered that they weren't actually arguments in the academic sense. Rather, they were contradictory polar opposites, and so our initial idea to find the intellectual middle ground, it came to nothing. Although we do report our first efforts in this area in our conference paper at the 2010 Chair Conference, and that really, the failure to address that point led us to say, well, really, it's this contradiction between the positions that you have to address. If you want to measure humanities' value, you have to somehow resolve these arguments one way or the other. And so to do that, what we do is we draw on an idea developed by Burma and Glueson on the notion of policy concepts. And that is to say, there are a set of ideas that circulate in policy networks that look and sound like theoretical concepts, but ultimately, they're normative bundles of fact, ideology, belief, and wishes that shape the way policy develops. And unlike the theoretical processes with which academics are familiar, these are not reconcilable through logical arguments. They are reconciled through policy processes, political processes within networks, where institutional arrangements, these networks and arenas, guide policymaking to take hard choices. And they developed it on the basis of their analysis of spatial planning in Europe. And they were trying to define the idea of territorial cohesion, something that's at the centre of the European Union project, but is never really adequately defined. And they looked at the way that policymakers and the different communities involved in cohesion defined it. And really they found that what happened was people told 6 stories about what territorial cohesion meant to them and how it was a useful concept for them. And ultimately, those stories were not logically reconcilable. They didn't provide a logical basis for action. So when you attempted to develop indicators for territorial cohesion, people would tell different stories about what you had to measure. And ultimately, this undermined efforts to determine measures for cohesion. Because no one had ever defined it at the European level, no one could ever agree on what the appropriate measures for action were. And, even worse, because it meant different things to different people, it was hard to come to a definition that captured what mattered for the different groups. And so, although the project to develop indicators for territorial cohesion failed, for me this project was a success because at least they had an explanation of why they had failed, and this idea of policy concepts having to be somehow reconciled before you could develop indicators for them. And so that is my argument for the self-evident problem of developing indicators for humanities research value. What I talked about previously, the thinking about the public value of humanities research, is actually a set of policy concepts, a set of stories that different kinds of actors tell about the public value. And so what this slide does is it tries to break down the 3 arguments into 6 competing, different, parallel stories of the value of humanities research. And so clearly, we can see within these different stories that it's impossible to develop a single unified measurement system that reflects all these different positions. These stories are not mutually convincing. There's no hegemonic version of the value of humanities research that would ever reflect the different things that different users of these stories take from them. Now, policymakers can take one view and choose under particular circumstances to define the public value in one way. And for example, in the UK, there is a very definite definition of impact, which resolves these stories into a single definition, which is then used to measure the impact. But at that point, even though the policy battle is won, what it hides is that there is still an underlying set of theoretical tension. So my argument is that if we want to develop good measures of that research value, we need to have a proper theoretical understanding of what we're doing. We must not let our theoretical considerations stop with the policy concepts. Because although they look like theories that we, as academics, are used to dealing with, in reality they're nothing more than stories that are told for a reason. So we, as a scientific community, should decide on the basis of logics and empirics what we're talking about, the entities that we're concerned with, and then focus on the process and the dynamics of how those entities evolve, so what comes out of research ultimately to create impact in society. And so my argument is the most pressing issue that we have to address with, to come up with measures of public value of humanities, to come up with the public value of any research, is to get rid of these policy concepts and develop robust theoretical concepts for two things: public value and valorization processes. So in the second part of the paper, what I want to do is explore the nature of the policy concept and see what insights this gives us into the kinds of theoretical avenues we might choose to use. And my starting point is that behind the policy concept there lies a very naive, simple version of technology transfer logic. So public value is understood as taking a piece of research and that is translated through users, creating growth in firms, and ultimately the economic growth that's counted as societal benefit. Now, I'm not saying that technology transfer is not a robust theoretical framework, but the argument I make is that in the drive for policy innovation, an excessive simplification of the very nuanced corpus of literature has enabled an extremely unanchored and dangerous policy concept to emerge that's depicted in the slide. So the nuances of this literature that think about knowledge exchange, co-creation, academics having multiple roles, institutions and organizations functioning on different levels, providing knowledge and research from researchers to innovators through a kind of collective knowledge pool, all of that is missing from this naive heuristic. It reduces to simply research driving innovation in firms, creating firm growth, productivity growth, economic growth. So what I contend is that really this has happened because there's been an elision between a real set of technology transfer processes and an underlying heuristic model. So the top diagram here shows a version of the model by which research drives productivity growth and societal growth under very particular circumstances. Pharmaceutical research creating a patent which leads to a new drug, the drug is sold, and the sales generate jobs, tax, profits, and ultimately increase societal consumption, a clear public benefit. But what has then been lost is the nuance by which that process happens, the feedback loops that Klein and Rosenberg talk about, the mediating effect of the knowledge pool, the collective activity. And it's been reduced to a simple sense that research leads to progress. So whilst the top model highlights the clear and identifiable benefits that can be measured under particular circumstances, and then with a degree of ingenuity ascribed back to particular research outcomes, what we actually see is the model has become generalized. So no longer particular research projects, but all research. Clear identifiable benefits are much more nebulous social benefits. And this, unpicking this, is ultimately what we need to do. So my argument is that what lies behind this is there is a shifting causal chain in this argumentation from the piece of technology transfer through to the equilibrium growth benefits. So the shifting causal chain here sees different kinds of processes operating on different kinds of scales that have different kinds of claims attached to them, that have different kind of theories underpinning them, and that ultimately allow different kinds of claims to be made. And in the elision from the single research activities to societal benefits, this nuance has been lost. So a multi-scalar theory concept which says we can measure this and trace it back to particular outcomes has become generalized into a naive policy concept that says we must measure all research and we must trace all of these processes. And ultimately, my argument is that these two logical fallacies, a misapplication of the theory to technology transfer, lie at the heart of where the policy concept fails. And the point is, there's three other scales of activity that need to be better understood. So to move us forward, I want to talk about the three bodies of theory we might think of using that really allow us to pin down these different scales of public value. So the technology transfer is a good model in nuanced form of the basic layer of the creation of the research outcome. But it starts to break down when you look at users, and in particular different kinds of users. So my question becomes, what kind of theories can help us understand user engagement with research? And this is a topic that is very well understood in research evaluation fields. A huge amount of work has been done in the Netherlands in the ERIC project at a European scale with CIAMPI on identifying the kinds of audiences that you might have and the kinds of interactions that researchers have with audiences. They might be direct personal contacts, they might be indirect, mediated through products or media, and then ultimately they might be contractual relationships. And so the slide highlights here a number of literatures that I think might be useful in exploring the dynamics of this level of exchange. But the key point here is that part of the value lies in a research outcome being used in a productive way by a user. There's a transaction that can be followed. And what we should be doing here is following the transactions wherever they lead, not defining them and restricting them as currently takes place. So the next scale is the move to the meso scale, how users produce a kind of general, a wider benefit in networks. And ultimately, the interest in the process here is how do governance institutions guide researchers to ensure that their research creates public value, to create the best research, the best results, ultimately, the greatest benefits for society. And this requires thinking about value in a different way to user value than productive interactions. Ultimately, it's about accountability. And in particular, thinking about the way that institutional frames and the governance of institutional frames shapes the expression of value. So, understanding this from a new public management perspective highlights the point that you want to measure research value to count these public benefits. The point of doing that is that unless public benefits are counted, then it's not taken seriously within the science system. But what a reading of new public management literature can give us here is the point that there are considerable ambiguities in the way in which this becomes operationalized, in terms of the way that targets, goals, and incentives are set. And there's a good literature around this idea of public failures in the research process, attempts to measure public value that ultimately create perverse behaviors that reduce it. And so that's a second literature we might want to consider. And then, once we get outside the reference of the institutional frame, there's a third layer by which research benefits society somehow. And this, I think, to understand this, you have to look to literatures of cultural value. So, there's a set of ethical literatures that are concerned with answering the question of what do we need to live a good life, however that is defined. And this literature is very clear that markets cannot produce all those things that we need to live a good life. And once you accept that, it then becomes clear that market value is not a defining feature of what society values. It is one element of it, or it is an attempt to capture one element of it, but society values a broad spectrum of things, and you must have a mechanism for understanding how those valuations are translated through the governance system into research activity. Now, within the cultural value literature, there's a raging debate about whether cultural value is always positive, whether it has intrinsic or instrumental value. But a common feature of these positions is that what culture can do is create capacity to do things as a society that are not otherwise possible. And so humanities research can become part of that. It can create positive benefits, create societal capacities, understandings that allow society to do things that would not otherwise be possible. And so, in terms of a theoretical framework, I would firstly observe that there are many tensions and many areas of conflict. But unlike the policy debates, these tensions are not irreconcilable. These are areas of academic debate, and so logic and empirical examination can guide us through them. Now, I've listed on the slide the four most evident conflicts. And so, to illustrate one of them, for example, Sandel's point about the idea that markets not producing everything that matters, market logics crowding out what matters, seem to be at odds with using a new public management approach which attempts to define targets and measure progress towards those targets. But NPM does not have to set its goal in purely economic terms. It doesn't have to set its goal in purely numerical terms. So far, it has been normal to do so, but that does not necessarily mean that it is an underlying condition of the system. If you could bring together a system of accountability that captured societal capacities, then clearly research contributing to that would contribute to, would be creating public value. And at the same time, we can start to see that there is, within these various literatures, a consensus position, a consensus of where the public value of research might lie. And so the working definition I want to explore today is really the public value of humanities research, of research in general, relates to all four of these points. And so the question I want to ask today is, does this version of public value of research, in the case of humanities, help address the shortcomings of the policy arguments that we've seen? And what does this tell us about the kinds of appropriate theoretical framework that we might use for taking the measurement of that value forward? And I want to do this, explore this definition, explore the model in the context of a particular national situation, that of the Netherlands. And so my empirical research really was driven by the fact that in the Netherlands, there's an incredibly vibrant debate taking place about humanities, about its future, about what should be done to manage it better. And we see this taking place in Parliament, we see policymakers involved, academics, research funders, advisory bodies, commercial publishers, all interested in what humanities should be doing. We see last week in the leading newspaper, there's column inches are devoted to the debates about closing down the last department of Danish in the Netherlands. There is a public interest for understanding this. And from the 1980s, the purported decline or vitality of humanities in the Netherlands, its relationship to, its value to society, has been continually portrayed in print. And what we see is that the publics have actually been quite active in these debates, through the press, through the TV, through the radio, increasingly through the internet. But, as we've seen with other countries, the debate has not progressed particularly far about how society values research. And we actually see a living example of the problem of the policy concepts when we look at the current state of the art of the debate. This is, for me, what a policy concept looks like in practice. All publicly funded research in the Netherlands has to be evaluated every 6 years. And that process, the standard evaluation protocol, which is shown here, is a useful litmus test for understanding the debate. Now, part of the evaluation, the protocol, says that the social value of research has to be included. And the humanities research community spent 3 years discussing and highlighting the kinds of indicators you might want to use for measuring societal value. And these are reproduced on the slide. And to my reading, it is what it is. It's the outcome of a closed elite discussion where the public are not really present. The only voices that are heard are of academic producers and research funders. And what has emerged is a system that's agreeable to those producers, that has input rather than either output or outcome measures. But then, this seems very technocratic and deracinated to understand the public value of humanities research in the Netherlands. Because when you start scratching under the surface, you quickly find examples of substantial research impact. So there's a publicly funded research institute in the Netherlands, the Dutch Institute for War Documentation. Now that emerged out of very place-specific attempts to make sense and come to terms with World War II in the Netherlands and what happened around occupation, around resistance and collaboration. And in recent years, it's evolved into a centre of expertise in peace and reconciliation. Now, in 1996, NIOT, this centre, was asked by the Dutch government, at the time a coalition led by the Labour Party, to look at the role of Dutch peacekeepers during the Bosnian War, and in particular their role in a massacre where there was a substantial number of Bosnian civilians killed. And the report that was published in 2002 criticised the government substantially, including an ad hominem criticism of the Prime Minister and the ruling party. And they promptly resigned. And following those elections, there was a fantastic transformation in the Dutch political geology, from the left liberal of the Labour Party to an increasingly radical right wing, with a much weaker sense of societal self-confidence, a trend that we see continued in the elections to this day. But humanities research doesn't happen on publics at times of great societal change. It also, humanities research is impacting on the Dutch publics on a daily basis. We see this, for example, Dutch television audiences have a huge appetite to hear about humanities research. So, last month, the 21st of October, the 18th most watched programme on television on a Sunday in the Netherlands was a programme that looked at a public health emergency. A company had introduced a new margarine. The new margarine planter had created a mysterious disease. And the public health system had to try and deal with that disease quickly. And now this programme, it built on a book in which a professor at the Erasmus University had worked with a journalist to detail a range of historical case studies where technology had failed, of which this was an example. And the planter affair was one of the chapters in this book. But that chapter wasn't just taken up by the VPRO, the company that made that TV programme, which was watched by about 500,000 people. It was also used by the European Centre for Preventative Disease Control, because Arnold Bosman, the head of public health training, had studied under Professor Jan van den Ende. And so ultimately what we see is that through the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, public health officers in 27 EU countries learn about the practicalities of dealing with a new disease, a new problem, on the basis of a piece of historical research. Clear public impact coming out of that humanities research. So how can we make sense of this multi-level challenge, the technical indicators, the tectonic shifts, the more quotidian impacts? And one approach is that it is possible to find straightforward examples of linear flow of research from users to publics. And sometimes those publics can be huge in number, the 500,000 people who watch the history programme. And this slide shows a clearer cut piece of research, an excellent piece of research looking at idiophones in the African language. The researcher graduated cum laude, so the top 2% of Dutch PhD theses. But what we see is that researchers, viewers, and listeners in the Netherlands were prepared in huge number to spend amounts of time, quite often long amounts of time, 10, 12, 15 minutes of leisure time, typically no more than 3 hours a day, doing something different, consuming this research because of their interest in it. And so clearly we can start to talk about substantial numbers of people being impacted by this research on the basis of a linear flow. But on the other hand, you see areas where the public are not just recipients of that knowledge. They can be active in constructing the agendas within which knowledge is presented, in which voices are heard in academic debates, and which kind of academic agendas are set. So this slide details the case of Historisch Nieuwsblad. It has a readership of 25,000–30,000 readers, and that's a lay community of people who are interested in history, and in their consumption of the magazine they interact with, well, if not the knowledge production side of research, at least the circulation of that knowledge. Academic, humanities research is an important part of what this community does. The public are actively engaged in shaping that community, the key moments in its life, the conferences, the kinds of books. And the circulation of that research follows a set of pathways pathways within which you can see different kinds of public clearly present. Historical concepts circulate with publics consuming them, and the publics are active in constructing and defining those networks. And when you start to try and sketch that landscape a little more systematically, and this is our first heuristic attempt to do that, to define the forum, the arenas, the communities in which publics encounter, experience and interact with those concepts, with research, clearly the linear model starts to break down. Clearly the Srebrenica report about the massacre didn't cause a crisis of national confidence, didn't lead to the political shift that continues to this day, but it clearly was involved in shaping an evolving zeitgeist. So what we can see here in this landscape is the circulation of research in networks with clearly defined users via identifiable interactions and forums, creating the kinds of things that make a good society, new societal capacities, defined in terms of public benefits emerging from private assets. And this takes us, we can start to see that in terms of our research question, we need to come back to understanding the public value of research to capture this through looking at the different scales of interaction. So, having come up with the network landscape map, what I want to do in the final section is to think about these different scales at which this model for research value creation is constructed, and start to think about what builds and bridges between those levels as being important elements of the landscape. And by measuring what bridges between the different levels, you start to get a sense of how research is flowing to society. Now, I characterize this in terms of 4 stylized facts. Very simply, humanities research is active and achieves its value through a series of societal conversations. Those societal conversations involve concepts flowing, evolving, deforming, and ultimately dying out. Value for society emerges with the unself-conscious use of those concepts, of those belief systems, embedded within societal networks, institutions, and cultural repertoires. So, there is a need to focus any measurement systems on the social life of humanities concepts and how publics use those concepts. And of course, clearly, there's a scalar dimension to the process. We brought the scalar problematic up at the outset of the theoretical section. The network landscape isn't flat. The processes are operating at different kinds of scales. So the different elements are all present in a single process, but operate through their own distinct pathways. And when we start to disentangle the scale of those activities and use scale as a lens to understand how micro-activity produces macro outcome, we see that both the activity by which public value is created, as well as the magnitude and scope of that value, differ across these different scales. So the table looks at 2 things: the knowledge process and how knowledge is created at that scale, and how value is created at that scale. And so the value of research, good, high-quality research, can move up these scales more effectively than previously. So, at an individual scale, researchers may be creating new knowledge that may or may not involve direct users. Ultimately, what matters is the uptake process by which that academic knowledge becomes taken up within a personal community that interact with, that shape it, and ultimately transmit it up through into broader societal networks, that it becomes embodied in these broader formal, informal cultural assets. But it's suggesting a scalar model. What we need to do is to bear in mind the limitations of this approach and the risks that it raises by blurring between 4 very different theoretical corpus. Now, it's important to say that a scalar model is a way of thinking about the world. So what's distinctive about a scale is that similar processes operate in very different ways. So at the micro scale, a free market is about a group of people buying and selling unfettered by regulation and the price reaching an equilibrium. At a global scale, the free market is about the coordination of production networks in a way that brings goods as efficiently as possible to consumers. And when you go to an actual free market, like the market here in Enschede on a Saturday, and you go to a fruit stall to buy a crate of satsumas, what you see is two processes operating together. At the local scale, the different greengrocers negotiate or compete with one another to offer the best prices. But at the same time, there's a global production network that results in those satsumas being transferred from Valencia to Enschede. Reality doesn't map automatically to particular scales. In a single situation, many processes at different scales may be operating simultaneously. Individual, local, societal, cultural processes at these different scales may all be present in a single situation, and it's important to disentangle these different scales in particular contexts if you're actually to make sense of a situation. Upscaling is an important repertoire technique in multi-scalar approaches, understanding how the different scalar processes intersect in particular contexts. In particular, understanding how particular local action can drive wider change, in this case, how individual research projects can contribute to societal and cultural shift. So my argument is, interscalar connections are important. The ways in which individuals shape local contexts and networks, how these networks become embedded in societal institutions, and how that relates to the kind of broad, deep, informal cultures. So my contention is that what we need to look at is not just these four scales, or in fact is not these four scales, but the three upscaling processes between them, to understand ultimately how research reaches public. So my contention is that there's really three key upscaling processes here. My argument is that very little is known about them, much less how to measure these things. But before we can start coming up with good measures of public value, we need to be clear about these different scales and upscaling processes. So between the individual and the micro scale, how do users engage with humanities research? This idea of productive interactions. What are its broader dynamics more generally? Between the micro and the meso scale, where does humanities research feature in societal networks and institutions? And then ultimately, what happens to humanities knowledge when networks become and institutional frames shape cultural evolution? So this, really, is where I think we should be looking if we want to start to solve the policy problem we began with. How do you measure the public value of humanities research? How do you measure the public value of research more generally? So tracing the social life and tracing the contours of the social life of that knowledge as it emerges from the research base to affect institutions and society appears to be a critical focus for a future research agenda. And I stress that this applies just as much to science and medicine as it does to humanities research. Just for humanities research, in the absence of a kind of material connection between the research and society, the contrasts, the contradictions, the problems that relate to the circulation of concepts are hidden. And studying that process brings to the fore interesting dynamics that affect all kinds of research and its social impact. So a final question relates to how we can use the reframing of the problem to answer the policy question. How do we measure the impact of research? How should policymakers be looking at the societal value of research at a time of crisis when hard choices have to be made? And as a coda to this, we should never, as academics, mistake our duty to be useful society for an uncritical acceptance of the policy concepts of others, including policymakers. Sometimes policymakers' problems can arise because of problems in the policymakers, and we can help by making those problems clear to them.